Plants containing organic psychoactive drugs are found on every continent on the planet, and archaeological evidence has proven that these plants have been used by indigenous peoples for centuries, going back to prehistoric times. The smaller family of organic compounds, sometimes referred to as hallucinogens, but frequently called psychedelics, were not commonly known to the general public, but were about to become the most important catalyst that would ignite the social and cultural changes of the 1960s. The buttons, or flowers, from the peyote cactus, Lophophora williamsi, had been used by the natives in Central America since before the arrival of Columbus. Still legal in the early 60s and used by members of the Native American Church, there was a small following of beatniks and avant garde artists who began experimenting with peyote. Mescaline was the naturally occurring psychedelic proto-alkaloid present in the peyote cactus, which had been extracted and eventually biosynthesized by pharmaceutical companies. Also an uncommon drug in the American social landscape, mescaline was likewise legal and had its own bohemian advocates. The use of psilocybin mushrooms cannot only be traced to Mesoamerican tribes, but also to the Vikings, ancient Greeks, Egyptians, ancient India, and across prehistoric Eurasia. Primitive rock art in Spain, dated to approximately 4000 BCE, suggests magic mushrooms were used in religious rituals by prehistoric humanoids. Marijuana, Cannabis sativa and Cannabis indica, though much milder in its psychoactive properties, is in the same family as the other psychedelics and had been used by indigenous peoples globally for millennia. Illegal in the United States since 1937, marijuana was the most commonly used drug of the psychedelic family. Nearly impossible to determine for certain if its status as an illegal drug had diminished its use, marijuana had remained popular among jazz musicians, some African American subcultures, and had grown to be the prevailing drug of choice among the beatnik generation. The fact that it was illegal delineated marijuana smokers from other citizens by the mere fact that they were willing to break the law. But it is undeniable that the single most important catalyst of the Cultural Revolution that took place in the 1960s was the psychoactive compound known as LSD 25. Albert Hofmann was a chemist employed by Sandoz Laboratories in Basel, Switzerland. Attempting to create a respiratory stimulant, Hofmann used the rye fungus ergot as the base of his synthesis. After several unsuccessful attempts, in November of 1938, Dr. Hofmann's 25th derivative was successful. The compound that he synthesized was lysergic acid diethylamide, commonly known as LSD 25 or just LSD. With several drug syntheses going simultaneously, the LSD was placed into storage to await further experiments. 5 years later, on April 16, 1943, Dr. Hofmann removed the compound from storage and accidentally ingested a small amount. Retiring to his home, he laid down and entered in a dream-like state with eyes closed, perceived an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures, extraordinary shapes with intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. After a few hours, the effects diminished and his condition returned to normal. 3 days later, on April 19, 1943, Dr. Hofmann purposely ingested 250 micrograms of LSD. It was nearly an hour before he felt any effects at all, but then he noticed intense shifts in his visual perception. Feeling somewhat uncomfortable, he asked his laboratory assistant to accompany him to his home. The two men mounted their bicycles and started toward Hoffman's house. After a period of paranoia and fear, Dr. Hoffman began to enjoy the unprecedented colors and plays of shapes that persisted behind closed eyes. Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegating, opening and then closing themselves in circles and spirals, exploding in colored fountains, rearranging and hybridizing themselves in constant flux. After several self administered experiments with varying dosages, Hoffman was convinced that LSD could be used as a tool in the psychiatric profession. Sandoz Laboratories would be at the forefront of isolating the psychoactive compound found in psilocybin mushrooms and the synthesis of both mescaline and LSD. All these perfectly legal new pharmaceutical compounds would be shared with the global psychiatric profession. Through articles in scientific journals, the new drugs found their way into research and experiments around the world. And it was because of the visibility of the new drugs in the mental health profession that the United States Central Intelligence Agency got involved with LSD. Initially, LSD was strictly considered as a promising tool for the psychiatric profession. But once the CIA became aware of LSD's properties, they speculated if it could be used as a tool in the hands of the spy masters. Throughout the Cold War, the CIA was obsessed with anything they saw as super technology. High-tech gadgets and secret weapons were in development to keep up with the Russians. Agents were curious if LSD had any strategic value. Could it be used as a truth serum or to break the will of the enemy agents? The CIA was interested in using LSD as a dirty tricks weapon. In 1953, the CIA established Project MKUltra with an initial budget of $300,000. It was a program of human experimentation designed by the CIA to identify drugs that could be used during interrogation. The goal was to use brainwashing and psychological torture to weaken recipients and forcefully obtain confessions. Besides psychoactive drugs like LSD, agents used electroshocks, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, and other forms of torture. The CIA established safe houses, first in New York and later in San Francisco, to be used to experiment on unsuspecting civilians. Agents would lure unsuspecting victims into the safe house where they would secretly administer LSD and other drugs. Here they would learn about the effects of the drugs and sexual proclivities of the subjects, which was standard procedure in the traditional spycraft of blackmail. The supposed goal was to better understand the use of LSD on enemy agents and how to recognize the drug if the Russians were to use it on our guys. In time, the clandestinely funded project would be categorized as illegal, but that would be long after the 1960s and the profound impact that MKUltra had on some unfortunate members of the general public. Aldous Huxley was an English writer and philosopher whose work spans nearly 50 books. Nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature 9 different times, by the end of his life he was widely recognized as one of the foremost intellectuals of his time. His most famous book is Brave New World and is recognized as one of the top novels of the 20th century. In the early 1950s, Huxley would purposely ingest mescaline for the purpose of broadening his intellectual understanding of the world around him. A year before he took mescaline, he wrote, "From poppy to curare, from Andean coca to Indian hemp and Siberian agaric, every plant or bush or fungus capable, when ingested, of stupefying or exciting or evoking visions, has long since been discovered and systematically employed. The fact is strangely significant, for it seems to prove that always and everywhere human beings have felt the radical inadequacy of their personal existence, the mystery of being insulated selves and not something else, something wider, something far more deeply infused. After his experiments with mescaline, Huxley wrote about his experiences in his book The Doors of Perception, first published in 1954. He believed that modern humans had become so rational in their thinking that they had shut the door in their minds to the rich flood of senses that primitive man once experienced. It was Huxley's opinion that mescaline opened these ancient doors and allowed modern man to rediscover the hidden reality formerly denied to him. Huxley's analysis was that mescaline intensified the visual inputs at the expense of the temporal and spatial. He experienced a pronounced loss of will that led to a loss of ego. As Huxley's ego diminished its grip on the self, all sorts of normally useless data seeped into his mind, allowing him to perceive things he had never witnessed before. In The Doors of Perception, he described a garden chair where the shadows fell on the canvas, upholstery stripes of deep but glowing indigo alternated with stripes of incandescence so intensely bright that it was hard to believe that they could be made of anything but blue fire. It was inexpressibly wonderful, wonderful to a point almost of being terrifying. He continued, to be shaken out of the ruts of ordinary perception, to be shown for a few timeless hours the inner and outer world as they are apprehended directly and indirectly by the mind at large. This experience is of inestimable value to everyone. The man who comes back through the door in the wall will never be quite the same as the man who went out. Although Huxley never expressed that his involvement with mescaline provided what one would call a religious experience, he was deeply impressed with the drug. It is without question the most extraordinary and significant experience available to human beings this side of the beatific vision, and it opens up a host of philosophical problems, throws intense light, and raises all manner of questions in the field of science, religion, and the theory of knowledge. In its day, The Doors of Perception became the most famous literary description of a psychedelic experience. From the critical backlash, it proved to be the most controversial work that Huxley had written in years. After his experiments with mescaline, he was introduced to LSD. Allen Ginsberg was a poet and author. In the 1940s, he had befriended William S. Burroughs, Neil Cassidy, and Jack Kerouac. The four would become the core of the Beat generation. Like the other Beats, he was opposed to militarism, materialism, and any form of social repression, and consequently embraced counterculture values regarding sex, drugs, and even Eastern religions. His best-known work was Howl, published in 1956. Ginsberg wrote the acclaimed poem while under the influence of peyote. It is a sweeping diatribe of American capitalism, materialism, and conformity. There was something prophetic in angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo who passed through universities with radiant, cool eyes hallucinating. In 1960, Ginsberg was attending Stanford University, furthering his research into world religions, when he heard of a program at the Veterans Hospital at nearby Menlo Park. CIA Director Sidney Gottlieb, in a move to broaden the scope of Project MKUltra, arranged with the Veterans Hospital to experiment with volunteers. They were paying willing subjects $75 a day to allow the staff to administer psychomimetic drugs that supposedly induced temporary psychosis. One of the drugs administered was LSD. Ginsberg, who had already experimented with psilocybin mushrooms, peyote, and mescaline, immediately recognized that LSD was just a more potent form of psychedelic drug. There is a certain irony that one of the leading proponents of the LSD revolution received his first dose from the CIA. Jack Kerouac, along with Ginsberg and Burroughs, was one of the most important Beat Generation authors. Regarding the impact that LSD would have on the coming cultural revolution, Kerouac is the least important of these players. But from a literary perspective, he is arguably the most important. Kerouac's 1957 Beat novel, On the Road, was the biggest selling work in the genre, and its profound impact on a whole generation of young people coming of age in the late 50s and early 60s is immeasurable. In time, nearly every important cultural player of the 60s would come to cite On the Road as one of their most important influences. And within the pages of the Beat novel, the most compelling character is Dean Moriarty. Moriarty was the fictional name that Kerouac gave to the character based on his friend Neil Cassidy. Sal Paradise and Dean Moriarty are actually Kerouac and Cassidy crisscrossing the nation in their frenetic search for meaning in On the Road. Cassidy, the son of a Skid Row alcoholic, was a high school dropout and a petty criminal. But the well-read autodidactic also had a genius-level IQ with phenomenal lightning-quick recall. Many a college professor who specialized in a certain discipline of humanities or philosophy were humbled in the presence of Cassidy, who, using his rapid-fire recall, would astound them with his vocabulary of knowledge. Cassidy, more than any other giant of the period, had one foot firmly planted in the Beat Generation and the other planted in the psychedelic revolution of the hippie generation. Though not published in his day and not as socially impactful as the other players, he eventually rubbed elbows with more of the psychedelic revolution's important members than anyone. Dr. Timothy Leary is the most recognizable name among the LSD advocates of the 1960s. He received his PhD in clinical psychology from Berkeley in 1950, and in late 1959, he started as a lecturer in clinical psychology at Harvard University. While on vacation in Mexico, Leary had taken psilocybin mushrooms, after which Leary recalled that he was swept over the edge of a sensory Niagara. When he returned to Harvard, he decided to dedicate his life to this new instrument for psychology and recruited an enthusiastic young colleague by the name of Richard Alpert. Leary and Alpert organized the Harvard Psilocybin Project. For reference, Leary turned to Huxley's The Doors of Perception. Their plan was to study the mental and emotional effects of the drug on artists and intellectuals in a somewhat clinical setting. They came up with 38 volunteers. Using pharmaceutical psilocybin ordered from Sandoz Labs, the subjects were directed to take the drugs in pleasant, spacious surroundings. Volunteers included scholar Aldous Huxley, beat poets Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs, Zen expert Alan Watts, and philosopher Arthur Koestler. To outsiders, the results were probably confusing. Doctorate-level scientists and world-renowned scholars involved in a research program where they purposely ingested psychedelic drugs, after which they extolled the virtues of the experience by talking about love and ecstasy and a door to another world. When questioned by anyone unfamiliar with the psychedelic experience, the initiates insisted that one really hasn't understood anything until one has been there and returned. As the experiment progressed, the number of volunteers expanded to include graduate students and junior faculty members. To outsiders, the topics of conversation were disturbing, like the death of the mind and the rebirth of the uncensored cortex. And then Dr. Leary was introduced to LSD. Immediately recognizing that LSD was a more intense psychedelic experience than either mescaline or psilocybin, Leary got Harvard to purchase 3,000 doses from Sandoz. Harvard's LSD project became the most dramatic of the school's psychedelic experiments. Eventually, over 400 applicants received over 3,000 doses over a few months. In 1962, Leary and Alpert founded the International Federation for Internal Freedom, IFIF, for the purpose of studying the religious use of psychedelic drugs. Out of the IFIF came the Psychedelic Information Center and a national LSD newspaper. Leary and Alpert's research into psychedelic drugs garnered so much attention that applicants had to be turned away, after which a black market for psychedelics became available on the Harvard campus. By 1962, Leary's psychedelic research was alarming university authorities and garnering negative press. Journalists wrote condemning articles. John Monroe, dean of Harvard, issued a memo strongly warning against the evils of drugs. Leary and Alpert responded in their LSD newspaper that the control and expansion of consciousness would be a major civil liberty in the next decade. In February of 1963, the IFIF distributed its pro-psychedelic literature to all Harvard students, graduate students, and faculty members. A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. Eventually, Harvard administrators ordered Leary to surrender the supply of psilocybin, and a special committee was formed to advise and oversee any future experiments. In response, Leary said, "These drugs apparently cause panic and temporary insanity in the many officials who have not taken them." On April 30th, 1963, Dr. Timothy Leary was terminated from his position at Harvard for allegedly failing to attend scheduled lectures. He asserted that he had met all his obligations and that the termination was over drug use among students. All the psychedelics used were pharmaceutical grade and completely legal at the time. With Leary fired and the project terminated, Leary, Alpert, and around 10 of their followers retreated to a hotel in Zihuatanejo, Mexico. The use of psychedelics continued as a vehicle for the teams to conduct independent research. Participants included clinical psychologists, engineers, businessmen, and students. The atmosphere was permeated with themes of modern psychology, New England mysticism, and a modified form of Mahayana Buddhism. Topics included Tibetan Buddhist concepts of mystic separation of the death and rebirth cycle, and Zen Buddhist pragmatic philosophy of Satori. But the team and their drug use garnered the attention of the authorities, and the Mexican government expelled them over trumped-up visa issues. In September of 1963, Billy Hitchcock, a wealthy Wall Street broker who was sympathetic to the cause, offered Leary's team to move into his Millbrook mansion in upstate New York. The 20-room mansion and additional cottages could easily accommodate Leary's growing entourage of psychedelic explorers. On weekends, Millbrook would attract over 100 of the curious: jazz musicians, avant-garde painters, underground filmmakers, high-level procurers, mysterious Orientals, and other creatures from the New York City's nightlife. Leary and his original followers were psychologists, and they still approached the experience in a very clinical and scientific way. But many of the revelers that found their way to Millbrook Mansion were just thrill seekers, curious about the latest thing. Dr. Richard Alpert introduced Billy Hitchcock to LSD, and over the next few years, he took it over 50 times. In his own words, he found it to be a tool for the process of growth. I wanted to share the experience and further the movement. In 1964, Timothy Leary, Ph.D., Ralph Metzner, Ph.D., and Richard Alpert, Ph.D., published The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It was and remains the preeminent literary source about psychedelic drugs. Ken Kesey was an American novelist and a crucial link between the Beat generation and the coming psychedelic revolution. He was both a collegiate athlete and a scholar at the University of Oregon. Recognized for his literary talents, he went on to Stanford University to pursue his doctorate in English literature. While at Stanford in 1960, Kesey volunteered for the experiments being conducted at the Veteran Hospital in nearby Menlo Park. Most participants didn't know that this was a CIA-funded operation. In a hospital setting, Kesey, along with Beat poet Allen Ginsberg, Robert Hunter, future lyricist for the Grateful Dead, and others were administered a range of drugs including psilocybin, mescaline, DMT, and LSD. Kesey would return every Tuesday for approximately 7 months, experiencing the gambit of psychedelic drugs that the hospital was providing. It was during these tests that Kesey got a job as an orderly working the night shift on the psychiatric ward. The job brought in a little income, and due to the slow pace on the night shift, Kesey found time to work on his first novel. He became completely absorbed with the lives of the patients and staff. His first observation was that the system was not interested in curing the patients, but rather in subjugating them. Between the sedatives and the psychological domination, they kept the patients docile, specifically targeting the weaknesses that had brought them to their madness. They kept them doped with tranquilizers, and if that wasn't adequate, they sent them to electroshock therapy as a punishment. He started writing about the scenes he had experienced, both as a medical guinea pig and of the patients on the ward. The end result was his first novel, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Published in February of 1962, the book immediately confirmed Kesey's reputation as one of the new literary contenders. The book was both a critical and financial success, and the following year he sold the film rights for a hefty sum. With his newfound wealth, Kesey purchased a home in La Honda, California, with a powerfully amplified stereo system in the house and speakers both inside and in the trees belting out rock and roll. His house in La Honda became a magnet for beatniks, Stanford professors, and a new type of drug user, the acid head. They all took LSD on numerous occasions. For them, acid was a vehicle to remove the unconscious structures that encumbered one's ability to experience the magic of the present. In Kesey's words, the first drug trips were, for most of us, shell-shattering ordeals that left us blinking knee-deep in the cracked crusts of our pie-in-the-sky personalities. Suddenly, people were stripped before one another, and behold, we were beautiful, naked and helpless and sensitive as a snake after skinning, but far more human than that shining nightmare that had stood creaking in previous parade rest. We were alive, and life was us. Out of this group of inner explorers seeking truth and meaning during the process of the death of the ego, formed an inner core of devotees eventually known as the Merry Pranksters. And it was on a day in 1962 that the beat legend Neal Cassady found his way to Kesey's house in La Honda. Cassady had read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and he recognized himself in the central character Randall Murphy. He was so struck by the novel that he learned how to find Kesey, drove to La Honda, and introduced himself. From that moment until the day he died, Neal Cassady would be a central player in Kesey's group of merry pranksters. Soon after that, Ken Kesey purchased a 1937 International Harvester school bus. The pranksters painted it in a variety of psychedelic colors and designs and outfitted it with bunks and a kitchen. Then, in 1964, the merry pranksters set off on a cross-country trip from La Honda to Leary's mansion in Millbrook, New York. And who better to drive the bus than Neal Cassady, famed cross-country driver from Kerouac's On the Road. It was a wild, rambling tour de force by crazed hipsters through square America, later chronicled by author Tom Wolfe in Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. Kesey and his companions, fueled by LSD, were crossing the country, encountering alarmed citizens as they went. When the bus finally arrived at Millbrook, the pranksters were anticipating the great meeting of the minds. Leary meets Kesey, East meets West, but it all fell flat. Leary was unavailable, but his second in command, Dr. Richard Alpert, gave the pranksters a tour of the Millbrook mansion. The pranksters thought the mansion resembled a mausoleum, and they dubbed it the Crypt Trip. The pranksters' more fun-loving, down-to-earth approach clashed with Leary's very academic following, so it was back on the bus and back to California. The failed meeting of the minds was a harbinger of the major division that was going to develop in the psychedelic movement. Though Kesey and Leary were introduced to LSD at nearly the same time, their experiences had led them in different directions. Augustus Owsley Stanley III, popularly known as Owsley or by his close friends as Bear, and eventually earning the moniker the Acid King in the media, was the first known private individual to manufacture mass quantities of LSD. While attending Berkeley, he had his first LSD experience, dropped out of college, and set up a laboratory in his home. Even though LSD was perfectly legal at the time, Owsley kept his lab an underground secret and successfully produced doses estimated into the millions. Once described by government agents as the man who did for LSD what Henry Ford did for the automobile, dubbed by Timothy Leary as God's secret agent, he was the first underground chemist to produce high-quality LSD in massive quantities. Owsley acid became recognizable by everyone in the scene, and eventually his name Owsley would be found in the Oxford English Dictionary as a term for LSD. Owsley saw himself as an alchemist who was on a mission to make LSD available as a tool to alter history. The goal to get LSD into the hands of the masses was primary. Profits were a secondary goal and were held in trust. Eventually, he would give away large quantities of LSD at Ken Kesey's acid tests and to audiences of Grateful Dead concerts. He would personally design and fund the Grateful Dead's groundbreaking sound system. In some senses, he was the Prohibition era bootlegger reincarnated into the Psychedelic Revolution. For anyone who has participated in the psychedelic experience, describing it to the uninitiated through the process of verbal narrative lies somewhere between impossible and extremely difficult. First, there is a sensory flood of tactile input. The world, in some respects, can be felt like an extension of the flesh. Physical waves being felt are coincident with other things happening within one's field of view that can bombard and penetrate the body. Then there are the visual images whose written description pales in comparison to the actual experience. What Hoffman described as an uninterrupted stream of fantastic images of extraordinary plasticity and vividness and accompanied by an intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. Imagine being immersed into a Vincent van Gogh canvas where all the fantastic images come to life and ripple and breathe and pulsate with a rhythm that is in sync with the universe. Whether the participants' eyes are open or closed, one is aware of a swarm of colors similar to a pointillism painting. Tactile, visual, and other sensory functions overlap so that visual images and tactile sensations are synced in a manner never experienced before. Then there is, for lack of a better term, the death of the ego, a consciousness-shattering experience where the self is seen as if from the outside and objectively for the first time. For those with some level of identity crisis, it can be a horrifying experience. For those more psychologically stable, it can bring positive change into their lives forever. And then there is the aspect of becoming aware of a separate reality. The natural world becomes alive in a way that had never been viewed before. Birds, bushes, trees, sky, all pulsating with life in a manner previously unknown. For many initiates, it is truly a door to another world that they enter, learn, and then return from. It is as if all of us are merely sleepwalkers, and the psychedelic compound opens the brain's ability to perceive, and we are awake for the first time in our lives. Beginning with Darwin's publication of On the Origin of Species in 1859, through two world wars and the development of the atomic bomb, a question that intellectuals frequently asked was, are we doomed to self destruction? Followed by, is there a way to speed up evolution and push our species to a higher level? Is there anything accessible that can enable this process? The proponents of psychedelics were indicating that these drugs might be that path. When using psychedelics as a probe into the unconscious, the results, even of world renowned scholars, frequently included mystical religious experience. In the academic community, religion was the archenemy of science. Was religious belief merely a product of neural brain chemistry that could be generated by drugs or fasting or a blow to the head? Or were mystics correct that higher awareness was always residing within us? For those who had undergone the psychedelic experience, it was impossible to explain to the uninitiated what it felt like to experience being one with the universe. Academics who did not take part and were confused by what the advocates were raving about were quick to condemn the psychedelic movement as a dangerous drug crazed cult. In response to the criticism, Huxley wrote, how odd that writers like Belloc and Chesterton may sing the praises of alcohol, which is responsible for about two-thirds of the car accidents and three-quarters of the crimes of violence, and be regarded as good Christians and noble fellows, whereas anyone who ventures to suggest that there may be other and less harmful shortcuts to self-transcendence is treated as a dangerous drug fiend and wicked perverter of weak-minded humanity. Paraphrasing Gurdjieff, most people are walking in their sleep. In response, Timothy Leary said, listen, wake up, you are God. You have the divine plan engraved in cellular script within you. Listen, take this sacrament. You will see, you will get the revelations. It will change your life. You will be reborn. Among Leary's acolytes, a new buzzword was transpersonative, which meant one who had evolved past the ego. Those who were living beyond the persona, the role or mask which we normally are compelled to exhibit socially. Eventually, what came about was a schism in both the beat culture and the academic community. Those lacking the nerve to go through the door and take an honest look at themselves and their views were left behind with their wine bottles and Zen. Soon, beats and the academic community were divided into the aware and the rest. Mixed in with all the religious epiphanies were the political questions surrounding the psychedelic revolution, taken from Timothy Leary's LSD newspaper. A major civil liberties issue of the next decade will be the control and expansion of consciousness. Who controls your cortex? Who decides on the range and limit of your awareness? If you want to research your own nervous system, expand your consciousness, who is to decide that you can't and why? Or, on the one side, the psychedelic visionaries, somewhat uncertain about the validity of their revelations, embarrassedly speaking in new tongues, and on the other side, the establishment, the administrators, the police, the fund-granting foundations, the job givers, pronouncing their familiar lines in the drama, danger, madness, unsound, intellectual corruption of youth, irreparable damage, cultism. The issue of chemical expansion of consciousness is hard upon us. You can hardly escape it. You are going to be pressed for a position. Internal freedom is becoming a major religious and civil rights controversy. In his 1967 book, Alternating Current, Octavio Paz wrote, "We are now in a position to understand the real reason for the condemnation of hallucinogens and why their use is punished. The authorities do not behave as though they were trying to stamp out a harmful vice, but as though they were attempting to stamp out dissidents. Since this is a form of dissidence that is becoming more widespread, the prohibition takes on the proportion of a campaign against a spiritual contagion, against opinion. What the authorities are displaying is ideological zeal. They are punishing a heresy, not a crime." People within the psychedelic community shared a dissident view of the government, and since no establishment wants to lose power, these dissident views had to be either discredited or silenced. The psychedelic advocates produced an unusual answer: make enough LSD to turn on the world, or at least that portion that would be receptive. It was a naive notion, but then the entire movement had a certain naivete. The logic was get enough LSD into the hands of enough people to fuel the social revolution, and then the world would live happily ever after. Beginning in late 1965 and running up through early 1967, Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters held a series of events called the acid tests. Held in public places, most were in San Francisco and Los Angeles. Posters stating, "Can you pass the acid test?" were printed advertisements of the event. Underground chemist Owsley provided the LSD. The Grateful Dead performed at most events accompanied by psychedelic light shows, which were a new visual enhancement of the time. The events, the LSD, and the musical performances were all free of charge to those attending. Kesey was attempting to create a new art form that was a total experience, with all the senses open wide: words, music, lights, sound, touch, lightning. Back at Harvard and at Millbrook, Dr. Timothy Leary had stressed set and setting, urging experimenters to take the drug in a serene setting while classical music played. Initiates should meditate on what one wanted to discover while in the heightened state. They recommended a guide who had taken LSD before to help the newcomer through any uncertainty, and the pranksters' response to Leary's guideline was, "Fuck that." The pranksters were into experiencing the now. Leary's restrictive conditions felt like the constipation of the past, the very things they were trying to break free from. The pranksters wanted the setting to be as unserene as possible, and one's guide should be nothing more than your own brain and your unique desires. Kesey hoped to achieve an event where the audience forgot that it was an audience and became part of the unified process of creating art. If through sight, sound, senses, and even a little bit of hypnosis, one could lose track of the self and become part of a group, then for that brief moment in time, one individual could become any other person within the group and walk away with an experience more vivid than anything previously encountered in their life. But when Leary heard about what Kesey was doing with the acid tests, he was not happy. The esteemed Harvard professor had sacrificed his academic career to promote the psychedelic revolution. It was difficult enough to keep the straight multitudes from having hysterical reactions to LSD, even when presented by doctors in the field of psychology, let alone when it was being handed out for free by a bunch of unqualified partiers hosting a wild event in a public place. By the end of the acid test period, Owsley became a silent backer of the Grateful Dead and created the biggest speakers in the industry, which enhanced their wall of sound. He had tabulated millions of doses of LSD with names like Blue Cheer, Orange Sunshine, and White Lightning, and journalist and author Tom Wolfe had chronicled the pranksters' exploits in his 1968 book, Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. Prior to October of 1966, though LSD was still perfectly legal, the increased visibility of psychedelic drug use was garnering national attention. But besides the medical profession's opinions and the government's involvement, the most powerful voice determining the future of LSD was the press. When it came to psychedelic drugs, the medical profession was undoubtedly the most knowledgeable, and most wanted to keep the drugs available for use in the psychiatric profession. But when journalists combined their ignorance of the subject with their sensationalist style, it is when nationwide panic started to rise. Speaking about truth versus sensationalism during a congressional hearing about psychedelic drugs, Senator Abraham Rubikoff from Connecticut stated, "Only when you sensationalize a subject matter do you get reform. Without sensationalizing it, you don't. That is one of the great problems. You scientists may know something. A senator may know something, but only when the press and the television come in and give it a real play because it hits home as something that affects all the country do you get action." The medical statistics were just public relations statements that made good headlines, but were actually irrelevant. The motive behind making LSD illegal wasn't because it made a tiny percentage of users crazy, it was because of how it affected the majority. LSD wasn't attracting nonconformists, it was creating them. And if there is one thing that any government does not want to encourage, it is dissidence. Dr. Stanley Yoles, the director of the National Institute of Mental Health, stated that, "I have a strong feeling that if we make the possession of LSD illegal, it will drive it further underground and make what perhaps is the beginning of a flaunting of authority, a more pathological process, and a more strongly assented act of rebellion." He believed that punitive measures would spur the growth of the underground market for psychedelic drugs, which was exactly what came to be. On October 6, 1966, California banned possession of LSD, and production of the drug shifted to a flourishing underground economy that never went away. Dr. Albert Hofmann continued working at Sandoz Labs and in 1979 published a book titled LSD, My Problem Child. Within, Hoffman stated that, "I see the true importance of LSD in the possibility of providing material aid to medication aimed at the mystical experience of a deeper, comprehensive reality. Such use accords entirely with the essence and working character of LSD as a sacred drug." He expressed that if LSD were used in the right conditions, then in the future this problem child would become a wonder child. To the very end, Hoffman continued advocating for the use of LSD as a clinical tool, and though his position was respected in certain academic circles, the bad reputation that LSD had acquired had too many powerful political implications for most researchers to rise above. On April 29, 2008, Albert Hoffman died at the age of 102. The fact that the CIA trafficked in LSD, heroin, and crack cocaine is well documented and has been the subject of many books and documentary films. Their experimentation with LSD, both in clinical settings like Menlo Park and in the unethical, clandestine dosing of unaware victims during Project MKUltra, are well known. The MKUltra project was active from 1953 to 1973, at which time it was deemed illegal and brought to a halt. The alleged suicide and subsequent wrongful death allegations of scientist and CIA associate Dr. Frank Olson has been thoroughly researched in several documentaries and books like A Terrible Mistake, The Murder of Frank Olson, and the CIA's Secret Cold War Experiments. The fact that the CIA smuggled heroin in American soldiers' coffins from Southeast Asia to be distributed in various U.S. city ghettos has been completely authenticated, was the subject of a report submitted to Congress, and was detailed in Alfred McCoy's The Politics of Heroin, CIA Complicity in the Global Drug Trade. The CIA's trafficking in crack cocaine to be distributed in Los Angeles was well documented in Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Gary Webb's book, Dark Alliance, the CIA, the Contras, and the Crack Cocaine Explosion. The value of Aldous Huxley's work in the field of psychedelics has been debated from both sides, but the one fact that is not in doubt is that he broadened the awareness of psychedelics for the average person. The fact that he took LSD out of the laboratory and ingested it in the privacy of his own garden setting was a milestone in the transition of LSD from clinical tool to a drug available for personal experimentation. In The Doors of Perception, he described the psychedelic experience as something outside of materialism, and the drugs themselves as linked to a journey of self-awareness colored with tinges of Eastern religion. His books would be embraced by psychedelic advocates for decades after his death. Intellectual author and Nobel Prize nominee Aldous Huxley died of cancer on November 22, 1963, the same day as the Kennedy assassination. Allen Ginsberg was an author and poet, along with William S. Burroughs, Neal Cassady, Jack Kerouac, and a handful of other Beats. He was a founding member of the Beat generation. Ginsberg was one of the volunteers who was given LSD at the CIA's MKUltra Menlo Park experiments. He was a speaker at the Human Be-In in 1967 and a highly visible presence in many key moments during the height of the Haight-Ashbury. Ginsberg was vehemently opposed to militarism, materialism, and sexual repression, and continued to be an outspoken advocate for the legalization of marijuana. He will always be firmly established as an icon of the counterculture. Allen Ginsberg died on April 5, 1997, at the age of 70. Jack Kerouac was the most famous of the Beat authors, mainly due to the huge commercial success and critical acclaim of his 1957 Beat novel, On the Road. Not actually a participant in, nor an advocate of the psychedelic revolution, his impact on the counterculture is still immeasurable strictly from the impact that On the Road had on the hippie generation. Jack Kerouac died on October 21st, 1969, at the age of 47. One of Kerouac's closest friends was Neal Cassady, immortalized in On the Road as the character Dean Moriarty. Cassady would go on to be associated with more members of the Beat generation and the coming psychedelic movement than any other important personality of the day. Not only was he the wheelman in Kerouac's crisscross country adventures in On the Road, he was also at the wheel of Kesey's famous psychedelic school bus in the Merry Pranksters cross-country adventure in 1964. Close friends with Kesey, member of the Merry Pranksters, present at all the acid tests, one-time roommate of the Grateful Dead, beatnik, hippie, and psychedelic explorer Neal Cassady died of exposure on February 4th, 1968, at age 41. After being convicted of his marijuana charge in March of 1970, Timothy Leary was sentenced to prison. He made a dramatic prison escape and fled with his wife to diplomatic immunity in Algeria. He spent some time as a fugitive in Europe and then was arrested in Afghanistan. At his arraignment in the United States, the judge set his bail at $5 million, and he was subsequently sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security prison. He was placed in solitary confinement right next to famed mass murderer Charles Manson. In exchange for early release, he became an informant for the FBI. When released from prison in 1976, he briefly entered the witness protection program, but once again was in the public eye, continuing to cash in on his own celebrity by conducting a series of public lecture tours. In the last decades of his life, he steered clear of advocating drug use and promoted ideas around space colonization, the cyberpunk network, and virtual reality. Dr. Timothy Leary died on May 31st, 1996, at the age of 75. Dr. Richard Alpert was Leary's associate at Harvard during the earliest years of experiments with psychedelic drugs. When he and Leary were dismissed from Harvard, he followed Leary to Mexico and then to Millbrook. In 1969, Albert traveled to India, where he studied Eastern philosophy and changed his name to Baba Ram Das. In the wake of his time in India, he published his best-selling book, Be Here Now. The 1971 book on spirituality, yoga, and meditation is recognized as a seminal work in the genre that popularized Eastern spirituality among the counterculture generation in the West. Ram Dass would prove to be a prolific author in the genre over the next 4 decades. He died on December 22, 2019, at the age of 88. Ken Kesey jumped bail on a marijuana charge, but eventually turned himself in to authorities, served his time, and when released from jail, moved back to his home state of Oregon. His exodus marked the end of the Merry Pranksters, whose members scattered to the 4 winds. Though Kesey and the Pranksters had left an indelible imprint on the Psychedelic Revolution, the bus and the Pranksters' headquarters in La Honda and the Pranksters themselves would not be a presence in the upcoming chapters of the revolution. The original Prankster bus was parked in the woods on his farm, but a replica of the original 1937 International Harvester bus was painted by Kesey's friends and donated to the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., where it now resides. Ken Kesey died on November 10, 2001, at the age of 66. Augustus Owsley Stanley III, better known as Owsley, and in more intimate circles as Bear, was a pioneering audio engineer and best known as the first underground chemist to synthesize LSD. Owsley developed the Grateful Dead's Wall of Sound, one of the world's largest mobile sound systems ever constructed. By his own admission, between 1965 and 1967, Owsley produced somewhere near 5 million doses of LSD for street consumption. Owsley's associate and underground chemist Tim Scully said, "I thought that folks would generally use psychedelics pretty much in the way I and my friends were using them, which was a healthy way of using them for personal and religious experience. People use them pretty frivolously and often dangerously." Their conclusion was that a lot of harm came out of the psychedelic revolution, but they knew many veterans of the movement that fervently claimed that everything good in their lives came from their experiences on psychedelics. The well-adjusted survivors were adamant that the end of the Vietnam War, women's liberation, and the environmental movement were all outgrowths of the psychedelic movement. After his legal trouble and prison time, Owsley quit the underground chemist business and focused exclusively on providing and managing the audio systems for Hot Tuna, the Grateful Dead, and eventually the Jefferson Starship. Eventually, he immigrated to Australia, where he died in a car crash on March 12, 2011, at the age of 76. If you found this subject interesting, then I recommend that you seek out the 2 accompanying documentaries, Who Were the Hippies and The Haight-Ashbury at Its Highest. If you have a passion about this subject and would like to learn more about what happened to the leading voices of the psychedelic revolution, then I urge you to seek out my book, Rebellion, a 300-year saga of one family's struggle with authority, the Shays Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, New Orleans, Storyville, Pendergast, Kansas City, the Haight-Ashbury, and beyond.